Alrighty, here recording for pod31 on this one. Again, we're continuing with Plato's Phaedo, and this will be my second episode recording today, so basically setting land mammalian speed records as far as this is concerned. But here, we're going to be continuing with Plato's Phaedo at around, in the Greek pagination, around 61D. And so we've just heard Socrates essentially telling his fellows that he has been composing poetry using the fables of Aesop and versifying the first ones he came across. So he has been kind of a Johnny-come-lately to practicing of poetry, which we discussed it last time, but to sort of re-emphasize, poetry for the ancient Greeks is just kind of a generalized term. Poesis means just sort of making in general, and so arguably to engage in poetry for the first time is interesting and ironic for somebody like Socrates, but again, this is the material. You don't have to basically, question what Socrates is saying. You can just kind of take what he's saying and, analyze it for what you will, but you don't want to get too bogged down in the nonsense and it's not the throwing the baby out with the bathwater thing, but it's, again, trying to get the best use out of the intellectual material rather than sort of in the style of the young people that follow Socrates around, just looking for the sort of the entertainment of the intellectual takedowns and the the this, that, and the other that Socrates engages in, and then I think you just miss the broader lessons that can be learned, the philosophical points at hand, etc. So to continue on this one, so just to read Socrates' last words: tell this to Venus, wish him well, and bid him farewell, and tell him, if he is wise, to follow me as soon as possible. I am leaving today, it seems, as the Athenians so order it. So, with that in mind, we're going to continue, because it's just an answer right to it. Said Simmias, what kind of advice is this you're giving to Venus, Socrates? I have met him many times, and from my observation, he is not at all likely to follow it willingly. So then Socrates replies, how so, said he, is the Venus not a philosopher? I think so, Simmias said. Then a Venus will be willing, like every man who partakes worthily of philosophy. Yet perhaps he will not take his own life, for that, they say, is not right. As he said this, Socrates put his feet on the ground and remained in this position during the rest of the conversation. So, I did like an hour and a half episode last time, going just from when Socrates is rubbing his legs and sitting up on the bed and talking about sort of the pleasure of being released from his shackles and etc., etc. And then we've moved here, and then Socrates finally sort of swings his legs down from the bed, and he puts his feet on the ground, remains there. So likely just sitting, kind of leaning forward on the bed, talking to all of his fellows, and like I mentioned last time, he's ordered Xanthippe and the baby out of the room, so he's gotten rid of any of the women and or children that might have been there, and it only leaves him and his adult male friends. You think of that what you wish, but so to go through what he says, so he tells him, follow me as soon as possible. And, you can take that very simply as, and this is trigger, but, he's saying, kill yourself, but then later he's basically making this kind of a joke. It's like, but it's not, it's against the rules, or people say it's not right to kill you, and they're right about that, of course. And he sort of just does that and doesn't even sort of acknowledge sort of the craziness of the thing that he just said. But again, this is, you have to take it for what it is and not try to maybe impose your own morality on it, just to kind of look at what he's saying and acknowledge the fact that, kind of like a Jesus figure again, to make that sort of comparison. These guys, whether or not their historical existence was exactly as it's related to us by their most devoted apostles, I think you can definitely say that they both had interesting opinions on the issue of death. Jesus' stated opinion essentially being, why do you weep for people when essentially, if you have the faith that a resurrection, an end times, an eschaton, a restoration of something is on its way, then you essentially don't pity people who've gone, from the material world and have now kind of withdrawn back into the more purely spiritual, or whatever the idea is. But he specifically, I think might be Lazarus or another thing, where he basically comes upon them and is kind of like, well, what are you crying for? And basically kind of orders them to stop crying on account of, essentially, you lack understanding, you lack faith, you don't comprehend that this is not quite the way you see it. And again, it's very similar to Socrates' sort of opinion on his death, where it's, people are sort of misunderstanding and then they're getting emotional. But from his vantage point, he was trying to occupy a somewhat rational ground, although, like we said last time, Socrates is apparently chasing dreams right now, writing this poetry, and has been getting dream messages to him for a long time, telling him to practice and cultivate the arts. And so, whatever you think of that, because you could really break that down more and be like, what are the arts? What is practicing? What is cultivation? And what are the two of those in conjunction? They're different. So, practicing is the doing, whereas the cultivation is the development and continually improving the product, etc. So those things just to keep in mind. But again, I think here, this is where I would argue that Socrates is really leaning into his irony side and probably knows very well what he's doing when he's doing it. He's not doing it to be completely of the sincere route, because again, he doesn't know what will happen after death. It would seem you'd have to have knowledge of that in order to be so secure. But as the dialogue goes along, we will see that Socrates really does have strongly held opinions on these matters that, on the one hand, you would consider unconventional, which we will go over why it's considered unconventional as we go through. But you've already seen the basic form of Socrates in these dialogues, where he basically considers a definition given that's either customary or typical, and then summarily disposes of it for one reason or another, and then leads them to the point of aporia, which then leads the conversation in a different direction of how to resolve that sort of moment of feeling like you've been stung by the whatever fish that comes along, and then boom, you're paralyzed. Because this is what people make an analogy that Socrates does to people, is he's like that fish, and he tags you, and boom, all of a sudden you're so paralyzed, your ideas are jumbled up, and you're not properly articulating the sort of culturally handed down wisdom that you so often just mindlessly repeat to other people. And then somebody like a Socrates comes around, basically is like, It's funny how your ideas make the most amount of sense when you do the least amount of thinking about them. But the moment you start thinking about your ideas and look at the consequences of them, you realize just how foolish and frankly stupid a lot of aspects of common sense and common wisdom tend to be. And therefore, again, to bring up the Meno problem, is kind of how do you recognize knowledge when you come about it if you haven't been going about things in a principled manner from the beginning. It's sort of the discussion of the road up versus the road down. If you think about it in terms of a street, if you have a street, especially if it's a two-way street, but any street that doesn't really matter, you can look at it from one way, look at it from the other way, meaning, let's say you're at the end of one street, let's call it the west end of that street, and then there's an east end of the street, and so you're looking from west to east at the street, and you see the street one way, and then there's also the street coming the other way, which you don't see, but you know is real as well. And then are those two streets the same? Are they different streets? This is sort of a version of a Heraclitus, do you ever step in the same river twice argument, but basically considering the road up and down, the powerful nature of the metaphor is relating to Plato's sort of overall question in his philosophy about principles, arguing from principles or arguing towards principles. Essentially, do we have the proper principles to base ourselves on, to build upon? Do we need to sort of destroy the foundations and recreate them in sort of a Cartesian style of thinking about things? And so again, the road up and down, you can use an example of so the one road up is materialism, and then the other road down is idealism. And maybe you're the materialist and you're looking at things from the materialistic perspective, and you're seeing things coming in from the idealistic perspective, and you're saying, well, that's kind of the opposite of the way I see it. And then you realize, well, the way up and the way down are actually the same thing, but it's really the perception of the way up and down by the perceiver is what makes sort of the difference. But that perception is also not an illusion. It's an aspect of the things where you can literally say there's a way up, there's a way down, and then to apply the metaphor most directly, it's essentially asking, do we argue from principles or towards principles? In other words, does discussion start with certain principles in mind, and you like I said, you build on those? Or are we trying to reestablish those foundations in the first place? And then what that means usually in the Plato sense, the idealist sense of things, is basically you have to reject materialism, you have to reject sense-based knowledge, you have to reject these things that will mislead you, these things that sort of, as Plato, the Platonic term of participation, they participate in the forms, but they're not the forms themselves, and that's what Plato would, through Socrates, would have you focus on. And we will see that this is sort of the result of this way of thinking later on in this dialogue, articulated probably better here than anywhere else in the Platonic sort of corpus. But you just what am I trying to say here? Well, because I don't want to get too far down the road of the way up and the way down, but it's an important metaphor to sort of consider, and yeah, I just explained the living hell out of it. And then so sort of get back to the discussion that Socrates is having with Simmias right here. Simmias basically responds to Socrates, says, what kind of advice is this? I've met Avienus many times. I've observed he's not likely to follow that advice. And then Socrates, so I think this is meant to be sort of a joke, or he's slightly trolling this guy Simmias, whom maybe is his associate and friend. He's come long enough way to fucking visit Socrates. He's not nothing to the man, and he's talking to him, but clearly though Simmias is not, he's not Crito. Like Crito, again, he's got that dialogue named after him. He's mentioned in the Apology. He's mentioned obviously in Crito. He's mentioned here. Like, there are certain people we can say were probably in a closer social circle to Socrates than others. And by the way, that just prompted me to remember something. I mentioned a pod or so back, this idea of scholars looking into the sort of social networking analysis of ancient sort of, well, I'm not going to overanalyze social networking, essentially, and analyzing the ancient period on the basis of that. And I had known that was an emphasis or a matter of her research of a professor of mine, Diane Klein from George Washington University, taught me an ancient Greek history survey class on ancient Greek history. That class was great, and she was she taught about Alexander the Great, and I think there was a class during my time there on classical Athens or Periclean Athens, and all sorts of other stuff. And so just wanted to really quickly acknowledge that, because even I have her husband's book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, which is his book about sort of the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. And so, well, I only say this to say that I remember discussing that, looking it up really quickly, and then seeing that that Professor Klein, she had passed in 2023, I believe. And so I just wanted to mention that quickly, that that professor of mine taught me a lot about Greek history, as far as taking that survey class, which covered basically all known history of the Greeks up until essentially Alexander the Great started with his conquests, and then it sort of leaves off at around 332 BC. But just to mention that really quickly, a slight tip of the cap to Diane Klein for that research, because I think when I said it previously in the other episode, I think I kind of was a little dismissive of it, and should have reflected more. And honestly, I knew a little better that that the work was obviously of a scholarly sort. There are scopes and methods to it of which I wasn't particularly aware, but within the field it had gained a certain cachet, and that counts for something rather than completely nothing. And so just wanted to mention that quickly. So there's that, and then obviously, so Socrates' rejoinder to Simmias, saying, "How so, said he, is Venus not a philosopher?" Clearly this is a case of irony, because Socrates is clearly saying more than his mere words imply by themselves. So, responding to somebody who tells you, I'm not sure that my sophist friend from wherever the frig Venus is from, Paros or whatever, it's like it's unlikely he's gonna follow your advice to follow him into death willingly. And it's like basically responding without clarifying first, but really just jumping to the logical point at the end almost, and saying, "How? But isn't he a philosopher?" And then Simmias says, "I think so." But then Socrates says, "Then Venus will be willing, like every man who partakes worthily of philosophy, yet perhaps he will not take his own life, for that they say is not right, As he said this, Socrates put his feet on the ground and remained in this position during the rest of the conversation. So, here I think Socrates is sort of, it's a little sly what he's doing, but he gives up the joke a little bit when he says, Venus will be willing, like every man who partakes worthily of philosophy, so not a Venus will do so, just that he will be willing. In other words, a Venus, if he practices philosophy, will not have the irrational attitude towards death, that it is something to fear, escape, etc. And we've seen enough in both Apology and Phaedo of Socrates' opinion on these matters, and that's why it's good to have gone through it in a close read. So I don't need to tell you why Socrates thinks that that's typical of people who practice philosophy, and then he sort of backs away from the cliff a little bit when he says, yet perhaps he will not take his own life. So, he gives it away. It's like, all right, sorry, didn't mean to say, he won't kill himself, but again, it's charged what he's saying. You could argue he's being a little flip in what he's doing, but he says, perhaps he won't take the life for that they say is not right. But again, we've kind of heard on a number of occasions what Socrates thinks about what people say. And there's a variety of things he thinks. Sometimes he thinks what people say is good. Sometimes he thinks what people say is bad. Sometimes he thinks what somebody says is commonly accepted wisdom that should be regarded as complete and utter bullshit. And so, again, I think to say what Socrates said and then to sort of try and deaden the joke a little bit by saying perhaps he will not take his own life. I mean, this again, social conventions, behaving, not to use this word in a terribly judgmental way, but behaving slightly strangely, these are things worthy of note. But anyway, so he does say at the end, perhaps he will not take his own life. That, they say, is not right. So at least he's kind of accepting this for argument. And then, so then Cebes asked, how do you mean, Socrates, that it is not right to do oneself violence, and yet that the philosopher will be willing to follow one who is dying? So this is where I think this dialogue really shines, is not only the number of interlocutors, but the good job that they do of asking really good questions. I swear if you had somebody like, no offense to him, but Phaedo or Euthyphro leading this discussion, these fucking dummies would have already been pleading their lack of ability to follow, etc., etc. But, Cebes asks a great question here when he says, how do you mean it's not right to do oneself violence, yet the philosopher will be willing to follow one who is dying? And then Socrates responds, come now, Cebes, have you and Simmias, who keep company with Philolaus, not heard about such things? And there's a note about Philolaus, so let me see, it's telling me to check pages 97 to 99, which I believe is that's leading me back into the sophist part of this book. Oh, I see. So Philolaus of Croton, so there's a whole section on him, and I don't even want to waste time on this guy's section here. Yeah, you could read that. The cosmos is one, blah, blah, blah. Talking about what the Pythagoreans said, etc. So basically, Cebes and Simmias, Socrates telling us that they keep company with Philolaus, arguably in a similar manner to how they keep company with Socrates. So this is another figure to sort of keep in mind. And then Socrates basically says, well, you guys hang out with Philolaus, so surely you've heard such things. And I wonder, I'm actually going to flip through Philolaus right now because I thought it wasn't worth my time, but then it certainly seems like Socrates is saying that Philolaus has something in particular to say on this matter, which is Socrates' little glib comment there about following him. So I'm just going to read these fragments because most of these guys are in fragments. So first fragment, nature in the cosmos was joined from both unlimiteds and limiters in the entire cosmos and all things in it. Don't you love when these things just make sense right off the bat? Another one, it's necessary that things that are be all either limiters or unlimited, or both limiters and unlimited, but not in all cases only unlimited. Now, since it is evident that they are neither from things that are all limiters nor from things that are all unlimited, it is therefore clear that both the cosmos and things in it were joined together from both limiters and unlimiteds. The behavior of these things in turn makes it clear for both of them that are from the limiters limit those that are from both the limiters and the unlimited both limit and do not limit, and those that are unlimiteds will evidently be unlimited. That is fucked. I'm gonna, before I continue reading this babble here, I'm gonna read the little bio that they give of him. So, certainly never knew Pythagoras himself, who died before 490, probably the first of the Pythagoreans to write a book, may have been one of Aristotle's chief sources for his accounts of Pythagoreanism. In Plato's Phaedo, two associates of Socrates who are present at his death, Simmias and Cebes, are represented as Pythagoreans, said to have studied with Philolaus in Thebes when he visited mainland Greece. According to Philolaus, cosmos is made up of what he calls limiters and unlimiteds, fitted together in what he calls a harmonia, literally a carpenter's joint, also a musical fitting together or harmony. A harmonia is expressible in a numerical ratio, and thus, according to Philolaus, can be known. On this view, the cosmos as a series of numerical relationships becomes intelligible to humans. In Philolaus, we see Pythagorean assumptions about the power of number at work, although it is possible Aristotle's famous claim that the Pythagoreans said that everything is number is Aristotle's own interpretation rather than something any of the Pythagoreans actually said. It is not, for instance, present in any of the extant fragments of Philolaus. So, we've got that absolute babble that I just said to you before, which I'll say it again. Nature in the cosmos was joined from both unlimiteds and limiters in the entire cosmos and all the things in it. So, I think arguably here, maybe this is something along the lines of a Heraclitus sort of idea, but there's sort of flux and contradiction. There's limiteds and unlimiteds in the nature of the cosmos, and that basically the nature of the cosmos is that there are contradictions kind of out and about all throughout the cosmos. And to say he's a Pythagorean means he's in the tradition of Pythagoras, although says he certainly never knew Pythagoras. Probably the first of the Pythagoreans to write a book, one of Aristotle's chief sources, and then says Simmias and Cebes are represented as Pythagoreans, said to have studied with Philolaus in the city of Thebes, which is it's mentioned in the Phaedo that Thebes is a city nearby that Socrates, I think, considers to have decent laws, if not good or great laws, whatever. But just to give some context there, that Simmias and Cebes are Pythagoreans. And so there's an interesting idea here where, sorry about the pause, just had to clear my throat a bit, but point is that I was getting to was this idea of the cosmos made up of contradictions, etc., but they fit together in a harmonia, or carpenter's joint, so musical fitting together or harmony. So these ideas, like for the Pythagoreans, study of music was important because music, as they discovered through understanding of scales and things like that, they could understand that music is somewhat regular in the sense that there's like a mathematical explanation for why, for example, two notes played together will sound good, whereas two notes played together will sound bad, as far as discordant notes versus notes that make pleasant chords. And you can sort of, I don't need to explain too far why music would have mathematics involved in it, and then therefore can be studied in a more serious way. But that's just some context that they're using this metaphor of a harmony, a sort of a stretching between of, seeming contradictions, but basically I think the idea is that when you understand the math enough, the secrets of the universe are progressively revealed to you such that you start to step beyond the world of illusion and you start to achieve something like what Plato will discuss in terms of his sort of world of the forms. And we will get there later in this dialogue, but I'm now basically seeing that this is probably not going to have any bearing on Socrates' little opinion about the nature of life and death, although this harmonia concept will be invoked later, I believe, by Simmias or Cebes, but they will mention this theory that essentially the soul is analogous to this, where the soul is the harmonia between all the different parts of the body, and therefore when the body is destroyed, therefore the soul is destroyed as well. And so those are things that are important. And so for the third fragment from Philolaus, there will not be anything that is going to know all if all things are unlimited. Number 4, and in fact all things that are known have number, for it is not possible for anything at all to be either comprehended or known without this. So all things are sort of the all things are number sort of idea. In fact, number has two proper kinds, odd and even, and a third kind, even odd, from both mixed together. Of each the two kinds are of each of the two kinds there are many forms, of which each thing itself gives signs. Concerning nature and harmonia, this is how it is. The being of things which is eternal, that is in fact their very nature, admits knowledge that is divine and not human, except that it was impossible for any of the things that are and are known by us to have come to be if there did not exist the being of the things from which the cosmos is constituted, both the limiters and the unlimited. But since the principles are not similar or of the same kind, it would be completely impossible for them to be brought into order, or for them to be kept in an orderly arrangement, cosmos, if harmonia had not come upon them in whatever way it did. Now things that are similar and of the same kind have no need of harmonia, but those that are dissimilar and not of the same kind or of the same speed must be connected together in harmoniae if they are going to be kept in an orderly arrangement, cosmos. So here I think we've got an expression of this Greek idea that essentially existence can't come from nothing, which is very different from, I would say, the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition. And go read, not Exodus, Genesis if you want. But what's going on here is that the Greeks are sort of pointing out, so it would be impossible for them to be brought into order if Harmonia had not come upon them in whatever way it did. Now things that are similar and of the same kind of no need of harm. So this is sort of this is like a difficult thing to really prove that basically well, yeah, it's difficult to prove other than in sort of a logical way that existence had to come from something that already existed, in terms of essentially there's no coming out of the void. There is only sort of the eternal nature of existence, and then it's sort of an arrangement into whatever form. But again, I'm lingering on this maybe a little too long just to see if he has any strange opinions on the nature of death. Actually, yeah, we'll go through all these just to double check on that, and then if this ends up that we don't get through much further, that's okay. But then this number 7, the magnitude of the harmonia is the fourth plus the fifth. Fifth is greater than the fourth by a 9-to-8 ratio. 4 from the lowest string to the second string is a fourth, and from the second string to the highest string is a fifth. But from the highest string to the third string is a fourth, and from the third string to the lowest string is a fifth. What is between the third string and the second string is a 9-to-8 ratio. The fourth has a 4-to-3 ratio. The fifth has a 3-to-2 ratio, and the octave has a 2-to-1 ratio. Thus, the harmonia is 5 9-to-8 ratios plus 2 half tones. The fifth is 3 9-to-8 ratios plus 1 half tone, and the fourth 2 9-to-8 ratios plus 1 half tone. That's a bunch of math. I don't understand it right now, and honestly don't care. The first thing that was joined, harmonized, the one in the middle of the sphere is called the hearth. That makes all the sense in the world. The cosmos is one. It began to come to be right up at the middle, and from the middle it came to be in an upward direction in the same way as it did in the downward direction. So again, remember I said the road up and down. And the things above the middle are symmetrical with those below. For in the lower regions, the lowest part is like the highest part, and similar for the rest. For both have the same relation to the middle unless they have been moved to another location. Here's another one. Some logoi are stronger than we are. That's from Aristotle's Eudaimonian Ethics, or Eudemian Ethics, pardon me. Then number 11, Philolaus correctly called the number 7 motherless, for it alone is of a nature neither to generate nor to be generated. Maybe that's about prime numbers. I don't get that. The head of intellect, the heart of soul, and the sensation navel of the taking root and the growth of the first, the genital organs of the depositing of seed and generation. The brain contains the principle of man, the heart of animals, the navel that of plants, and the genital seeds that of them all, for they all flourish and grow from seed. So interesting. The Pythagoreans similarly posited 2 principles, but added something peculiar to themselves, not that the limited and the unlimited are distinct natures like fire or earth or something similar, but that the unlimited itself and the one that itself are the substance of what they are predicated of. That is why they call number the substance of all things. So, just to go over that again, added something peculiar to themselves, not that the unlimited and the limited and unlimited are distinct natures like fire and earth or something similar, but that the unlimited itself and the one itself are the substance of what they are predicated of. That is why they call number the substance of all things. So these are more quotes about Philolaus than quotes from him, but a pupil of Philolaus signed what was the number of what. For example, this is the number of human... Okay, it's stupid. Okay, so they're just going over this math stuff. That's friggin' irrelevant. Let's read this last one and be on with it. In numbers, they, Pythagoreans, thought they observed many resemblances to the things that are and that come to be, such and such an attribute of numbers being justice, another being soul and intellect, another being decisive moment, and similarly for virtually all other things, since all other things seem to be made in the likeness of numbers in their entire nature. So, I guess this idea, what they're going through is basically the idea of defining things in part by assigning in any intelligible thing a particular unit number so that they, well, what is the point of that? Well, I guess this has certain, it just has certain consequences for symbolic logic, but I don't want to get to a field and frankly waste time on that. So in any event, we just ran through Philolaus just to know that when Socrates says, "Come now, Cebes, have you and Simmias who keep company with Philolaus not heard about such things?" They say, "Nothing definite, Socrates." Indeed, I too speak about this from hearsay, but I do not mind telling you what I have heard, for it is perhaps most appropriate for one who is about to depart yonder to tell and examine tales about what we believe that journey to be like. What else could one do in the time we have until sunset? But whatever is the reason, Socrates, for people to say that it is not right to kill oneself? As to your question just now, I have heard Philolaus say this when staying in Thebes, and I have also heard it from others, but I have never heard anyone give a clear account of the matter. So we're just about to get a clear account of that, which, thank goodness, certainly needed that. But interesting that Socrates says he speaks from hearsay, so that's interesting, but he doesn't mind telling you what I've heard, appropriate to one who's about to depart yonder to tell and examine tales about what we believe that journey to be like, what else would we do, and then they're asking Socrates to provide them a reason for why you don't kill yourself, and so, well, he said, must do our best, and you may yet hear one. It may well astonish you if this subject alone of all things is simple, and it is never, as with everything else, better at certain times and for certain people to die than to live. And if this is so, you may well find it astonishing that those for whom it is better to die are wrong to help themselves, and that they must wait for someone else to benefit them. So, let's just repeat what Socrates said, because it's a little fucked in the head, but we're going to give this man some grace here. It may well astonish you. This subject alone of all things is simple. It is never, as with everything else, better at certain times and for certain people to die rather than to live. And if this is so, you may well find it astonishing that those for whom it is better to die are wrong to help themselves. Must wait for someone else to benefit them. So Cebes, lapsing into his own dialect, laughed quietly and said, "Zeus knows it is." "Indeed," said Socrates, "it does seem unreasonable and put like that. Perhaps there's reason to it. There is the explanation that is put in the language of the mysteries, that we men are in a kind of prison, and that one must not free oneself or run away. That seems to me an impressive doctrine and not one to easily understand fully. However, Cebes, this seems to me well expressed, that the gods are our guardians and that men are one of their possessions, or do you not think so?" So, here, Socrates is starting to lay down the argument, and I said I might discuss John Locke this time. I'm not going to mention this, but I believe that John Locke is therefore probably making an allusion to Plato when he says that in, I think, one of his treatises on government, he goes over this idea that essentially one's life is not one's own to dispose, therefore, suicide is wrong. And again, that's in the Judeo-Christian context. But to hear Socrates' version of it, he says, so it seems unreasonable what I'm saying, but perhaps there's reason to it. The explanation that's put in the language of the mysteries, so again, we've got philosopher Socrates here talking about the language of the mysteries, so how problematic is that? But the mystery is we men are in a kind of prison, that one must not free oneself or run away. That seems to me an impressive doctrine, not one easily to understand fully. However, Cebes, this seems to me well expressed. The gods are our guardians, and that men are one of their possessions. So, again, the direct making of the same idea that fundamentally you belong to your gods, and then expressing the idea that so it's starting the idea, we men are in a type of prison, and it's a meat prison. It's the temple of your body as a prison because, as Socrates will point out, it's restraining in certain ways. It doesn't let you do pure thinking. You're always having to deal with impulses, this, that, and the other thing. So he says, the gods are our guardians, and it's interesting his discussion with Euthyphro where he pointed out, does it, he basically argues against the ideas that we tend to the gods in general by pointing out that gods don't seem to be the sort of thing that need to be tended to, but then maybe godliness, the essence of that is guardianship, who knows, so Cebes agrees with him that the gods are guardians, men are one of their possessions. I do, said Cebes, and would you not be angry if one of your possessions killed itself when you had not given any sign that you wished it to die? And if you had any punishment you could inflict, you would inflict it, certainly. Perhaps then, put in this way, it is not unreasonable that one should not kill oneself, for God has indicated some necessity to do so, like the necessity now put upon us. That seems likely, said Cebes. As for what you're saying, that philosophers should be willing and ready to die, that seems strange, Socrates, if what we just said now is reasonable, namely, that a god is our protector, and that we are his possessions. Is it not logical that the wisest of men should not resent leaving the service in which they are governed by the bag of masters, or best of masters? The gods, for a wise man cannot believe that he will look after himself better when free. A lo-fi man might easily think so, that he might escape from his master, or a foolish man might easily think so. He would not reflect that one must not escape from a good master, but stay with him as long as possible, because it would be foolish to escape. But the sensible man would want always to remain with one better than himself. So, Socrates, the naming what was said before, it is likely to do harm. The wise would resent dying, whereas the foolish would rejoice in it. I thought that when Socrates heard this, he was pleased by Cebes' argumentation. Glancing at us, he said, Cebes is always on the track of my some arguments. He is certainly not willing at once to be concerned by what one of ours says. And then said Simmias, but actually, Socrates, I think myself that Simmias has a point now. Why should truly wise men want to avoid the service of masters better than themselves and leave them easily? And I think Cebes is aiming his argument at you because you are bearing, leaving us so lightly, leaving those good masters, as you say yourself, the gods. You are justified in what you say, and I think you mean that I must make a defense against this as if I were in court. You certainly must, said Simmias. Come then, he said, and try and make my defense to you more convincing than it was to the jury. For Simmias and Cebes, I should be wrong and not to resent dying, if I did not believe that I should go first to you, the wise and good gods, and then to men who have died and are better than men that are here. Be assured that, as it is, I expect to go join the company of good men. This last I would not altogether insist on, but if I insist on anything at all in these matters, it is that I shall come to the gods who are very good masters. That is why I am not so resentful, because I have good hope that some future awaits men after death, as we've been told for years, a much better future than the good for the wicked. So we're gonna pause here at 63, 132, 63D. So again, they're really chewing on this point, and we've got people who are really good at this and are gonna make great points. Should truly wise men want to avoid the service of masters better than themselves, leave them easily. You are leaving us so lightly, and leaving those good masters, as you say, the gods. And yeah, I'm gonna just pause right there, because that's a good place to leave off. Get back to it next time. I'm getting a little bit tired, but yeah, so that's 2 in a day. And so to sort of go over, I guess to come up with a question for this time, basically the question, this is going to be a leading question. This is somewhat of a bad question, but I'm just going to ask it because it comes to mind, is basically, does Socrates do enough to convince you in that section alone that he's got the right of it, or is there something necessary that's going to have to follow in order to fully explain what's going on? And I think you know what my opinion is that as he goes along, he's going to further reveal this. And so with that in mind, though, I'm going to pause, because when we pick up again, we're going to really start getting into the meat of this dialogue and realizing there's a lot of material to go over. And so I just want to be patient here at the beginning. So that's it for, and that was pod 30 or 31, but that's it. All right, thanks.